CIA Chief's secretive Moscow mission. Mystery U.S. military jet lands as Washington and Kremlin stay silent. Why has America's CIA chief just flown into Moscow? CIA Director John Ratcliffe has reportedly traveled to Moscow for meetings with Russian officials after a U.S. Air Force C-17 Globemaster II made an unusual flight into the Russian capital. The journey turns what initially appeared to be a mysterious military aircraft movement into something considerably more significant: a direct high-level channel between Washington and Moscow, operating largely outside public view. What Ratcliffe is discussing remains undisclosed. Neither the identities of the Russian officials involved nor a detailed agenda have been publicly revealed, leaving an extraordinary gap between what can be seen, an American military transport aircraft landing in Moscow, and what is happening behind closed doors. The mystery plane was real. The aircraft at the center of the story was a U.S. Air Force Boeing C-17 Globemaster III, tail number 077181. Flight tracking data showed it arriving at Moscow's Vnukovo Airport on Tuesday, after flying directly from Riga, Latvia. The aircraft had reached Riga after traveling from the Washington area, creating a route from the center of American power through a NATO member state and into Russia. The C-17 is normally associated with military transport rather than conventional diplomatic travel, making its appearance in Moscow particularly conspicuous at a time of severe tension between the United States, Russia, and NATO. The Kremlin initially said it had no information about the aircraft's arrival. American agencies have also avoided publicly explaining the mission in detail. That silence created the mystery. Reports that Ratcliffe himself had traveled to Moscow provide part of the answer, but potentially open a much larger question about why the director of the CIA was the American official chosen for the mission. Ratcliffe is not an ordinary diplomatic messenger. A CIA director traveling to Moscow carries different implications from a routine visit by a diplomat. Ratcliffe sits close to President Donald Trump and occupies one of the most sensitive positions in the American national security system. His agency deals with intelligence collection, covert operations, counterintelligence, foreign liaison relationships, terrorism, hostage issues, and some of Washington's most closely protected information. His presence, therefore, does not prove that a dramatic agreement or intelligence negotiation is taking place. It does, however, make it difficult to dismiss the trip as ceremonial diplomacy. Ratcliffe has also already been involved in sensitive dealings involving Russia. His position gives Washington the ability to communicate on matters that governments may prefer to handle away from normal diplomatic publicity. That is often precisely the value of intelligence channels. Two governments can be adversaries in public while still needing ways to exchange warnings, negotiate sensitive matters, or determine what the other side is actually prepared to do. The timing makes the mission more important. Ratcliffe's reported journey comes at an unusually complicated moment for American foreign policy. Washington is attempting to manage continuing confrontation with Russia over Ukraine, while also dealing with the consequences of the Iran conflict and a wider competition involving China. American military resources, intelligence capacity, and political attention are consequently being pulled across several theaters at once. Russia, meanwhile, has recently signaled conditional willingness to consider new proposals over Ukraine, although Moscow continues to insist that any settlement recognize what it describes as the realities created on the battlefield. That territorial dispute remains fundamental. Russia controls substantial areas of internationally recognized Ukrainian territory, while Kyiv rejects the principle that military occupation should determine the permanent borders of a peace settlement. The gap is examined more deeply in Russia's latest signal that it could consider a new Ukraine peace agreement, where Moscow's apparent willingness to talk remains tied to conditions Ukraine would find extraordinarily difficult to accept. Against that background, Ratcliffe arriving in Moscow inevitably raises the possibility that Washington is testing another channel. It does not establish that Ukraine is the purpose of the trip, but the timing makes the question unavoidable. Intelligence channels can go where diplomacy cannot. Public diplomacy places governments in a difficult position. Every concession is scrutinized. Every photograph creates political symbolism, and every statement can become part of domestic propaganda. Intelligence diplomacy works differently. Senior intelligence officials can discuss prisoners, terrorism, military deconfliction, intelligence assessments, threats, ceasefire possibilities, and highly sensitive security matters, without necessarily creating the expectations that accompany a presidential summit or foreign minister meeting. That makes Ratcliffe potentially useful to Trump. If Washington wants to discover what Moscow really wants without formally launching another major negotiating round, an intelligence-level meeting offers flexibility. If the subject is something entirely different, prisoners, security coordination, or another undisclosed matter, the same secrecy is valuable. The important distinction is between what the visit could facilitate and what is actually known. There is currently no public evidence proving that Ratcliffe has brought a Ukraine proposal, negotiated a ceasefire, discussed sanctions relief, or carried a personal message to Vladimir Putin. There's also no confirmed public indication that Ratcliffe met Putin himself. Those possibilities should not be transformed into facts simply because the trip is unusual. The aircraft itself sends an unavoidable signal, even without knowing the agenda. The mechanics of the journey matter. An American military aircraft crossing into Russia and landing in Moscow is highly visible. It requires coordination, clearances, and knowledge on both sides, even if Russia's presidential administration was not publicly briefed on every detail. This was not an aircraft wandering accidentally into Russian airspace. A U.S. government mission reached Moscow at a moment when relations between Washington and Moscow remained shaped by war, sanctions, intelligence competition, and nuclear deterrence. That alone tells us something. The United States and Russia may remain strategic adversaries, but their governments have not stopped talking. In some circumstances, that is not a sign of friendship. It is a sign that the stakes have become high enough that communication is indispensable. Trump has reasons to keep Moscow talking. For Trump, direct contact with Russia could serve several strategic purposes. Ending or containing the Ukraine war remains one of the biggest unresolved foreign policy challenges facing his administration. Every additional month of fighting consumes weapons, money, political attention, and military capacity that Washington could otherwise concentrate elsewhere. The problem has become even sharper as American resources are pulled toward the Middle East. The broader risk is that simultaneous pressure from Russia, Iran, and China forces the United States to divide finite military and intelligence assets across several strategic theaters. That pressure is already visible in America's movement of additional naval power toward the Middle East, demonstrating why Washington has powerful incentives to prevent separate crises from escalating at the same time. Moscow understands that calculation too. Any Russian negotiation with Washington, therefore, takes place against a wider contest over leverage. Trump wants conflicts contained on terms he can defend as victories. Russia wants recognition of strategic gains it believes it has already achieved. The CIA director entering that environment gives Washington another channel through which those positions can be tested. Moscow also has reasons to listen. Russia has little incentive to shut down every connection with the United States. Moscow wants sanctions relief, acceptance of at least some of its territorial gains, and a European security settlement more favorable to Russian interests. It also wants Washington to recognize Russia as a great power whose security concerns cannot simply be ignored. Private engagement with a senior Trump official, therefore, carries value even if no agreement is imminent. It allows Russian officials to assess what Washington might accept and where Trump's red lines actually sit. The reverse is equally important. Ratcliffe's professional purpose is not simply to hear what Russian officials say. An intelligence chief will also be interested in what their behavior, demands, and willingness to negotiate reveal about the Kremlin's calculations. A conversation can itself become intelligence, what we still do not know. The most important parts of the story remain concealed. There has been no detailed public agenda. The Russian participants have not been formally identified. No agreement has been announced. There is no confirmed evidence that Ratcliffe met Putin, carried a new peace plan, or was dispatched to negotiate specifically over Ukraine. Even the connection between Ratcliffe and the C-17, while now widely reported by officials familiar with the visit, has not been accompanied by the kind of detailed public announcement normally associated with a major diplomatic mission. That uncertainty is not a minor detail. It is the story. Washington and Moscow have allowed enough information to emerge for the world to know that an unusual contact is taking place, while revealing remarkably little about what the contact is designed to achieve. The real story may be the channel itself. The temptation will be to search immediately for a secret deal behind Ratcliffe's journey. There may ultimately be one. There may not. For now, the stronger conclusion is simpler. Despite years of confrontation, sanctions, battlefield escalation, and intelligence warfare, Washington and Moscow still maintain channels capable of bringing the head of the CIA directly into the Russian capital. That becomes especially significant when normal diplomacy appears stuck. A breakthrough in Ukraine would still require enormous compromises. Relations between Russia and NATO remain deeply hostile. The Iran conflict has complicated Washington's strategic position rather than simplified it. Yet Ratcliffe's Moscow mission shows that beneath the public confrontation, another layer of statecraft continues. The C-17 landing at Vnukovo was the visible part. What matters now is what happened after its doors opened, and whether the meetings taking place away from cameras become the beginning of something much larger.